you very much. This is day 2, and we'll talk about Spring Cloud contract. Java is the key language for me. That's why I'll be talking about Spring Cloud mostly, and you can find links in my presentation. Have you ever worked with such contract? Good. So let me introduce myself and state my credentials. I've been writing in Java Kotlin. I've been team lead architect for about 6 years, and I have quite an experience in DevOps. So in addition to design, I also implementing, and I have to deal with some of the temporary fixes. I also teach at Bauman University and talk about microservices. So I talk about practical things. We could have seen each other in some other conferences. So what are we going to discuss? We'll talk about integration testing. Have you ever seen some of those tests? And do you have them? Okay, great. Also, we'll talk about contracts and why we need a contract for. Then we'll talk about the Spring Cloud contract, and we'll talk about concepts and talk about setup, tuning, and description, and publication and Nexus, and talk about working with the client. Server comes first, then client. And then in the end we'll talk about documentation and how can we get contracts. So what do we have here? So we have microservice architecture. If you only have monolith, then it's not an issue. You could test it. If you have microservice, you need to do something about it. So when the task is quite daunting, then QA is to look at it, and you might need the total regress. If your resources are limited, then the lead will say, "We'll do it in doc. Don't worry." Well, it looks good, but still, for integration testing, for complete regress, you would need content on demand. So you do one contour, integration contour, you run everything, and if it's okay, then it's over. But you need DevOps for this, you need pipelines, and it needs a lot of resources. If you have 20 microservices, you would have to do 20 machines, and that's quite an expense. Quite. And if something breaks down, if there's a bug, you can't stop the contour, you'll have to give it to developers so they would know. If you're testing just one single microservice in isolation, it doesn't make a lot of sense. You'll have to do most part of the architecture and databases, and so each time you'll have to deal with the entire contour. Why is it so difficult if you have def and stage? I don't think I should be explaining this. You've had that pain before. 2 tasks in parallel is quite difficult. You need time to deal with it. You launch a new cluster, and so you need for cubes to be deployed. It takes 20-30 minutes. You'll have to take a break. If you do it manually, well, that might take a whole day. If something breaks down, now you do the contour, but you just don't know what's happening. You need some data. You need to control or supervise what's taking place. In dev, it's more difficult because some of the data could be corrupt. If someone has 1,000 sales per month, and 1,001st gives a bug, and your scenario breaks down, and you say, here's what you need to do. Something broke down. This is normal process, and you'll have to deal with it. So when you do a separate contour, it's too difficult, too late to find out. In addition to just doing it, I don't think you'll see 10 shells and 10 logs. So it has to go to a real-cast stack. So in Prometheus, you'll see that services are ready. You have to trace it. You'll have to know how long the request takes place, why the timeout. So you need to do the contour on request. But not everyone has enough competence in DevOps, but something has to be done. So unit testing is not enough. They cannot guarantee anything after refactoring, perhaps. So this is quite obvious. You can use a mock, and for example, the developers could write service tests, but those bugs you described have nothing to do. You just don't know what happened because you don't know what the developers did. Then the tests are over. Well, you know, Prodi is the best option, and bugs have to be rectified as soon as possible. This is not a stable situation. The behavior could be outdated. So what can we do? Contract. Initially, when we talk about contract, this is when we have a consumer wants something from a producer. It's like a declaration. We need this or that, and based on that, I'd like to do something in the output. With unicorns and free park in downtown area, you'll have a very well developed task with all the reception criteria, and this is how you get the contract. The consumer use it as an option, and the producers implement it, and then you do the unit tests. This is how the pact works. But the Spring Cloud is a bit different. Producer generates the contract and then publishes it in the Jarnik storage, and then the consumer could do it. Well, in my work, I can see that most developers first write the server, and then they write the client part. Sometimes the consumer and producer run in parallel, but it needs more adaptation. So first the backend has to implement something, then the next service, which is a Appium consumer, so they would have a Swagger, and then they would implement. So in Spring, we start with producer, then based on this implementation we get a contract, and then we would implement the backend. So it all boils down to producer. In the correct paradigm, we implement the paradigm, and it works. And this is quite easy because this is how you can see how it works. And then Nexus, it starts up on Jarnik, and then the consumer gets this contract from Nexus, I use it as a wire mock, as a stub. But you may have seen this because it can consume JSON, and so you can use it not necessarily something embedded. Now, what do we have here? So the contract guarantees that those stubs could work. It's not just something abstract thing that this is confirmed by producer with the help of tests. Then secondly, we can publish those contracts, and then the consumer would get the updated version. So we use regular thing. We'll increment the minor version, we publish it, then consumer, it takes some time for consumer, then something breaks down, and that means we broke something down. So it's not difficult, it's like the hierarchy, and then you can trigger some other contracts, and then this is how it can work. This is easier than the whole full-fledged contour, and not the first bird will destroy the entire civilization. So we run tests. This is just not simply basically we mark outside requests. So we do the test containers, and then the service starts up as a full-fledged application, and then we add some test data, and it works in the code. So the developer would open the test if something breaks down, takes a look at it, and then you would see what happened. And this can work also locally. Problem also is that the developer must know how the npm tests work. This is quite simple, like a Python test or clean test, something that needs integrations and so on. On the client part, this is those contracts on the client part is confirmed by the fact that tests have been written. So what we get is that contracts would be confirmed and they have value. And this is probably the central part. Consumer and producer tests guarantee the validity of contracts. So consumer uses those contracts and producers guarantee its validity. So perhaps you would ask this question: what's the difference between open, Appium? This is like a Swagger. This is what the developers share when they're through with something. The difference is this is also a contract. You can generate models, but the contract is a bit different. It's also contains some of the parameters. This is what we get like an open app. This is just a declaration without any business rationale in it. Now let's see how it can be implemented in practice. Let's take a look at three services. We have order, delivery, and warehouse. So delivery and warehouse.
We have a method to obtain order service, delivery service, and warehouse service. Warehouse is not dependent on the other services, but order triggers warehouse and delivery. In the warehouse, you can obtain a list of products. You can book orders, which is for the warehouse, and the delivery can book orders saying that please flag it as ready for shipment. These projects can be found by following this code. So you will need a Docker, you will need Java, and this will be run through double clean build. So all of that is found in the repository, and if you're interested, you can run it through Soricon. So, the contract. Kotlin is used as Kotlin script as the most delicate way of writing a contract. We have description so that untrained people know what's happening, because those who compiled the contract have no idea or have no sense of what's it all about. So in this section here, you describe some sort of a business process. Then there is a request section, response section. It's readable, it's straightforward. It's a Hello World project. I worked on those in the production. We had a big jettison. And when you have 300 lines, Kotlin is the most laconic language to make any sense out of contract. Of course, JSON composed of 300 lines is not the best way to go. And if you have a lot of responses, it will be easy to read and it will make sound documentation for developers who need to who need to understand the text. Because sometimes it's not clear why you put in all those stubs. Why is this magic constant that keeps coming back? Here, input and output make the process more traceable. Moving on, we need the baseline test declaration to prepare the data. Here, we use order ID to return something, and this something needs to be put into the database. This is where we do it. This chunk here is derived from the project, but the highlight is in here. We configure rest assured to work with our Spring Boot, and this is where we utilize our data. From this baseline test, all other will emanate. This is where we say all contracts found in this folder, item state checkout, has base items controller test, base state controller test. Since the project is coded with Kotlin version 1.5, by default they use here 1.4. So at some point there were some funny errors saying method not found. Pretty weird. So this method is nowhere to be found in the code actually. So Spring Cloud Contract Kotlin brought along their own version of Kotlin, which was different from ours. So we created contracts, and after running our service tests based on GUnit 5, this is the stub we're getting, which is used in WireMock. And this is where we, upon launch, are obtaining this. As you can see, I have used Constanta. You can use any unit or any string, but if we don't explicitly say that we have this data for order ID, and for this order we have different ID, you won't be able to map other data. So this order ID is valid, it permeates all the contracts, and if you want to check success way, you use this. For other order ID, you will have not found coming back. So when it comes to some critical request parameters, you need to be careful about describing them in the documentation. Otherwise, what you'll get is an unsupportable code, because it will be difficult to map how it would work using multiple methods. So we have our stub. Now we need to put it in artifact and public and access. So what you do, here they use GitHub packages, so you can look it up in GitHub, and it's automated in GitHub Actions. The tests are done on the consumer side. This is, we have auto configure stub runner, which is the initializer of the process. Then we have SCC warehouse stubs and the port number, which is used to elevate it. This thing is important. It means we're going to pull up the latest version of the contract, and if producers changed an increment or minor version, implying there should not be breaking changes, our test should be good enough to continue working. So we will effortlessly make sure that not everything has been broken. Of course, it does not exclude the need for other tests, but at least it's some assurance that nothing is going to fall apart immediately. A second challenge I wanted to cover, since we have a little bit of time, is documentation. I know about test rails. Testers tend to have good documentation or good declaration of what you describe. Your input and output data, what you describe. Which of you have developers who use some consistency with the code? Do you give them good bidding? The problem is, as an ex-developer, I've tried doing this on multiple occasions, but I always failed. There was an urgent task coming in, and I made unit tests. I knew what unit tests were needed for, so that I won't be walking shamefully from the room. So you could use Control Escape just to delete the whole thing. What are the ways to go here? There is a ResDocs project which is capable of describing Appium. This is a replacement for OpenAppia based on tests. So you have some tests, Spring tests. This is where you write fields and other parameters. This is all based on ASCII-Doc template, resulting in this kind of documentation. If you've never familiarized with the Spring documentation, this is how this template looks. There may be some edit snippets as well. Basically, what they do is they generate documentation. A benefit here is that if we have an extra field or a missing field, it pops up as an error, alerting you and helping you monitor the consistency of the description in Appia. This thing is assembled into HTML, so you can use Confluence and put it on the server. This is not the only way to go working with the documentation, but here with little effort, based on available unit tests, you get a new set of docs which testers support, whether they like it or not. Because this is generated on your CI/CD when you run tests. You do use CI/CD to run your tests, right? Great. I'd like to end this talk with this. When we have unit tests, we can use them to generate a contract. So what I described to you prior to this point, it was contract first. So we publish contract at some point. But what if on the producer side we have some tests? We're not going to discard them like that, to rewrite them. We could use the same plugin to write wiremock section and to describe contract Java-based. This will not look as nice, even though it's only 3 lines. But if you have a large project with JSON, it will not look nice at all. But if it's a relatively small project and you already have a contract, this could be done. Once you've gotten this out of the way and you need to package it, unlike the previous version, we first need to write a new task based on jar, pack stubs and contracts in it, and go ahead with publishing. Now, findings and conclusions. Contract tests will not replace integration tests. This is a good supplement, enhancing specific stability, and you won't need to run integration tests when you know for sure that everything is broken. They will increase code quality. My experience tells me that a poorly written code will not result in a good unit test, good for testing. Of course, we are going to a high level here. Anyway, if a test is poorly written, the developers are going to suffer, ideally. So they better be written as service tests right off the bat. So it's a multi-layered construct with a variety of tests. But you better write it by pulling up state containers to be able to test something. WCAG is tested only on the epic layer. Spring Cloud Contract is a good solution. With good node integration, with REST integration. Anyway, wiremock can be launched as a standalone inside a mock. So if most of your projects are made on JavaScript, this is a good and not very costly solution for connection. And it's great to cover with this all the contracts. It didn't take a lot of time, and this enhanced code quality, and those spontaneous drops when testers say you've made a mess of it, you've made it fall apart. Well, I've covered that before. It does apply to Spring, but it's a bit hard to do. If you have a large library of languages, you better look toward Pact.
Because Pact is a bit different. So we didn't talk about Pact before. They also have contracts, but first they publish a contract consumer, and then the producer would implement. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, please go ahead. Telegram link, and then you can see how you can run it. I have a question. Am I correct to say that those are two different tools? Yes. Those are the data, those are not examples. Those are requests and answers, but there's also a unit of examples that's just abstractly described. It can be not necessarily corrected. So what are the advantages of Spring Cloud contracts? Like tomorrow I tell them, look, we do this and I need confirmations. So can you do separate contours? Yes, I can do that. Then perhaps you don't need it that much. This was more about for those who cannot do it. Okay. So if everything runs well with the test contour, we can do anything. We don't necessarily need this. But there aren't too many lucky guys like you. Thank you very much. Well, in our project, we have 3 test contours for teams, and people are just lining up, and quite often they have those bugs. For example, have a different branch coming in and everything just goes bad, and it's difficult to detect that because testers sometimes do my branch and it was working in the morning. Some committed something to develop, but then the developer says, look, we have error 500. And of course I look into TeamCity and see what was the last time things were coming in. But initially it was quite difficult to find out what's happening. New guys on the block are panicking, and then you tell them, look it up in the TeamCity. And such situations can lead to errors, like we had a field and it's ABC and it used only in the C service. In the previous app there was no such field, and this service C is down, but you don't understand the issue is about service A. Any other questions? Okay. Would that be correct to say that the service they want to test has outside contract, something it takes and gives, but the databases have to be taken care of as well? Yes, the test containers. So what you do, all those utility bases, all those queues, other integrations, you have to use those contracts as stubs. So how about Kafka? There's also an integration for queues, and you can do the same to Kafka. But we're doing what we can at the moment, and it works with the queues as well. Thank you. I can show you how it works in code. Any other? Shall I show you the code? I'd like to add something to my previous question, like JRPC. Yes, I've seen that, but it's a monstrosity. They have their own tools, they have their own contracts. This is XML, which is posted, but that XML would look just awful. Thank you. Perhaps there's a third version. They may have done something about it. Perhaps they can do something about it. but there was 2.2.4 version and it didn't work, and the people who needed it had to do it manually. Any other questions? Okay, let me show you this then. Can you see the code? So we configure the database to test containers. This is how we do it. And then we configure the database, test transaction manager, so the transaction could work and would drop. So between launches, the transactions would not be committed. Those are quite important things, because if you take it away, you'll have the test will affect the database, and only the container, when the container stops, it will drop. But when the unit tests have an order, this is not a good pattern. Well, you have to describe it in detail, like step 1, 2, 3, or you'll have to do it in isolation mode. And this is the configuration. This is what I showed in slides. Okay, any other questions? Okay, thank you very much. Then I'd like to invite you at 5 o'clock, and I'll have another presentation. I'll talk about the temporary fixes, and then we'll describe it, and we'll talk about Docker Compose at 5 o'clock, how we trained our QA, how when we cannot do counter on demand. In conclusion, I'd like to gift this to you. Yes, to you. Thank you very much for your attention. I was very happy to see you. We'll be happy to see you during the next presentation. Thank you.